Hello, everyone. I'm Stephanie Adams, the marketing manager here at Stanford University Press. I'd like to welcome everyone here today for our virtual event for Mauna Kea and her brand new book, Persianate Selves, Memories of Place and Origin Before Nationalism. A couple of items before we begin in earnest. Today's event is being recorded, and we'll be sure to email the link to the recording to everyone once it's available. And it'll also be available on our YouTube channel. Also, please feel free to post questions by clicking on the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. We'll do our best to answer as many of these questions as we can toward the end of the event. Mauna Kea is Associate Professor of Middle Eastern, South Asian, and African Studies at Columbia University. She earned her PhD from Harvard, her MA from NYU, and her BA from Vassar College. She was also a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for the History of Emotions, Max Planck Institute for Human Development in Berlin. Although it just came out, her book Persianate Selves has already received warm praise from both academics and the media. For instance, one reviewer wrote, "Besides its scholarly contribution, Persianate Selves is an indispensable and highly recommended book for world leaders, policymakers, and anyone interested in curing the monological ways of thinking about Islamic past." Mauna is joined in conversation today by a distinguished panel of scholars. Nile Green holds the Ibn Khaldun Endowed Chair in World History at UCLA. His many books include The Persianate World, The Frontiers of a Eurasian Lingua Franca, published by the University of California Press. Afshin Marashi is Professor and Persianate Chair in Modern Iranian History at the University of Oklahoma. He's the author, most recently, of Exile and the Nation, The Parsi Community of India and the Making of Modern Iran, and the co-editor of Rethinking Iranian Nationalism and Modernity, both published by the University of Texas Press. And Katherine Schofield is Senior Lecturer in South Asian Music and History at King's College London, is a historian of music and listening in Mughal India and the pericolonial Indian Ocean. She earned her PhD at the University of London and came to King's after a research fellowship at Cambridge and a lectureship at Leeds. And without further ado, I turn things over to Mauna and our panelists.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for being here. And I especially wanted to thank Stephanie Adams and Kendra Scheinert and everyone at Stanford University Press for making this event possible, as well as for making the publication of the book possible. I also really appreciate Nile, Afshin, and Katherine having taken the time to read the book and to be here today. I'm just going to take a few minutes to talk about kind of frame the project and give you a basic outline of the book. So as a graduate student studying modern Iran, I started having a sense of dissatisfaction with the focus of scholarship, which almost always seemed to be about Europe and what Iranians ambivalently learned or resisted learning. Then in one of my stints out of school, I read Amitav Ghosh's novels. First, The Glass Palace, which is set in late 19th and early 20th century Bay of Bengal, where much of my maternal family lived. And then after reading electrified by the tantalizing narratives that had Africans and Asians at its center. And these connections told a very different story of ties, affinities, and mobilities than the more common depiction of globalization as a modern phenomena brought to Asia by Europeans. So I began reading about earlier times before colonialism and nationalism, of Indian Ocean and intra-Asian circulations, and of the wider Persian-speaking world beyond Iran. And this led me to the foundational scholarship of Muzaffar Alam, Sanjay Subramaniam, Mohammad Tawakkoli, and I realized that my family's history of generations spent in Hindustan and in Burma was part of something far older and more vast. And hopefully, as many of you know, Persian was both a dominant language of the Islamic East and used by Muslims and non-Muslims alike. And from roughly the 14th to the early 19th century, it was a language of power and learning across Central, South, and West Asia, used for government, philosophy, Sufi literature, historical commemoration, storytelling, poetry, as well as ethical literature. As a result of a sort of heavy and continuous circulation of people, texts, practices, and ideas, there were a number of different levels of connection across something that we can maybe understand as Persianate Asia. But when I began reading Persian texts from the 18th and 19th centuries, I saw some disjuncture with the little scholarship that existed at that time. Now, this was, you know, about 15 years ago, and there's been a lot of amazing work since, including some of the respondents here's work. But a lot of what I read evaluated the period before modernity with categories, evaluations, and understandings that came actually from the later period. And this seems limiting to me because if you undertake investigation with too many assumptions, you generally find what you're looking for. So the work that I started doing was in part dedicated to trying to clear conceptual ground. And in general, the set of questions that I was working with was about the meaning of Persian culture, the social interactions possible within it, and its importance for understanding community and belonging before the rise of modern nationalism. Now, the term Persianate has been used in a variety of ways to describe the distinct political and cultural formulations and their kind of intellectual and literary corpus characterizing Eastern Islamic domains. It's not, one of the kind of art things that I've come to think about is the way in which the Persianate, its ideas, its sensibilities, its conceptions, also moves beyond the textual and amongst the literate, and the ways that it does travel through kind of oral and different kinds, other modalities. But the book itself, Persianate Selves, presents an argument about what place and origin meant for Persians across Iran and India in the 18th century, really between the fall of the Safavids in 1722 and when the British abolished the official use of Persian in India in the 1830s. Specifically, I outline the expansive and multiple notions of place and origin that allowed for a range of possibilities of collective affiliation, out of which pre-modern Persianate selves grew. And so in the book, I bring together a number of different texts that are understood as separate genres, such as biographical compendiums, travelogues, histories, memoirs, under the heading, and I call these commemorative texts, based on their shared imperative of commemoration, as well as other kinds of forms and features. The same sort of overarching logic of diversity, of difference legible as coherence, govern the range of possible conceptions of place and origin. Ultimately, I argue that multiple places and origins, a diversity understood as proper and necessary, constituted a range of Persianate collectives and their selves that crossed modern boundaries. So pre-nationalist Persians were from many lands, religions, occupations, social locations, and even genders, though these boundaries possessed aphoretic, porous, rather than categorical distinctions that I think require reassessment of their historical meanings. So the book has two sections. The first one has 3 chapters, and the first section is about place. And the overarching logic, the sort of central premise of those chapters is that the overarching logic of modern empirical geography was but one possible mode of knowing place. And because it was embedded in and continuous with other modes of knowing place that were different and even undermined empiricism, we can't view it as definitive. And so the 3 chapters in this section address the different significance of scales of place, possible modes of place making, and the way places were invested with meaning. So the first chapter, Landscapes, begins by outlining the flexibility and multivalence of terms. Chapter 2 illustrates the role of commemorating the near and far past in attributing meaning, both to places and to 18th century presents that were marked by the fall of the Safavid Empire and the devolution of Timurid power. And one of the things that I found is that different interpretations of contemporary events, so disagreement, nevertheless evinced remarkably similar understandings of lands, geographies, and their relationship to other places, all with reference to proper ethical forms in learning, in service, rulership, social interaction, and piety. Chapter 3 looks at the kind of cartographic effects of meaning making and the features of place that lent them a moral cast. And some of these widely recognized features were urbanity, learning, just rule, and the storied tradition of Persian and Islamic narratives that kind of work to connect the universal with the local and the particular. The three chapters in the second section are about origin. This section basically examines the meaning and labor of origins among Persians between Iran and India. And I begin with a common modern assumption that a homeland in the Safavid kingdom established a kind of primordial proto-Iranian loyalty that marked all migrants to India, even those in Timurid imperial service. And this is an assumption that is very, very strong in the early modern scholarship. And I wanted to kind of put a little bit of pressure on this because I found that modern scholarship possesses limited conceptual means by which to understand origin outside of mutually exclusive categories taken to be definitive. For instance, place is given a prominent place along with religion, nationality, ethnicity. And I sort of, as with place, I argue that modern categories are either not definitive or else entirely inappropriate. So in chapter 4, I argue that the form of origin was lineage, and that geographic place constituted lineage as a kind of part of them as an itinerary, but not as a singular location. And that alongside territorial lineages, there were often far more important ones of service, of learning, aesthetics, practice, and these call into question our understanding of meaningful connection. The fifth chapter is about kind of kinship without ethnicity, which kind of takes on the question of social collectives and affiliation to them. And I find that there are connections between various lineages of birth, legal status, but there are also very important connections between those more commonly understood ones and certain kinds of ties and relationships that were formal and socially regulated. And that this variety of lineages constituting origin requires a reconsideration of kinship that dislodges law and birth as definitive. Chapter 6 deals with naming, and it kind of builds on this more expansive notion of kinship to consider the ways in which naming captured their possibilities. And I look in particular at how the different ways Persians called themselves and each other, and how the names of both individuals and collectives linked people to groups and to each other in ways that were relational, contextual, and thus kind of different from the modern ways of understanding them. The last chapter is really kind of gets to this question of selves and collectives. And specifically, I'm coming back to the kind of changing political and economic factors in the 18th century that challenge social connections and these kinds of collective affiliations, which raised the stakes for commemorating a lot of these communities that were facing both fracture and reconstitution in both Iran and India. And so I focus on Tazkira writing in particular and the kind of insights they offer into the possibilities for articulating collectives and selves. And I look at poetic Tazkiras and the way in which they include past and contemporary poets as part of an imagined community of Persians. And this includes ancestors, peers, people you knew, people you didn't know. But I think the point is that the sheer number and diversity of these texts enunciate the many possible ways that collectives could be imagined and selves brought into being. And the argument really is that selves come out of these collectives, out of a sense of connections that get mapped. But the point is really kind of in the end, this was a Persian who could be affiliated with a multiplicity of places and have diverse origins that little resembled those demanded by nationalism. So that's the basic argument of the book.
So I'm assuming that it's over to me. Well, thank you, Mana, for that introduction, and thank you again for the invitation to join this presentation today. Well, I'm very glad to join colleagues and friends to celebrate the launch of Mana's book and to discuss Persianate Selves. I'd like to begin my commentary with reading the cover endorsement I wrote for the book. And since in that I tried to distill and condense my reaction to the book and my sense of why it's valuable. So I'll quote from there. Few questions are more vexed in the study of early modern South Asia, in the study of early modern Asia altogether, with evidence more evanescent than how people identified before nationalism. Persianate Selves is an invaluable vademecum for navigating the transregional Persianate past, end of quote. Well, as we all know, a vademecum is a handbook or a guide. It's from the Latin, go with me. It's something to take on a journey. And in using Latin in that endorsement, I wasn't trying to be merely pretentious, or at least not only pretentious. I was trying to evoke a sense of Persian as a shared but learned literary lingua franca, a language that was a second language for at least some or many of those who used it and constituted thereby the Persianate world. And secondly, I was trying to evoke a sense of Persian texts as mobile documents, whether they're points of writing, circulation, or reception. Of course, that's one of the great themes of Mana's book. Persianate Selves vividly brings to life this sense of books as outcomes of movement through spaces to which they themselves acted as guidebooks. And Persianate Selves is itself a guidebook to those earlier guidebooks, which themselves, of course, in turn, intertextually drew on other books, something which Mana's interweaving of her many different sources brings to life and captures very well. Persianate Selves is in this respect a literary navigation tool through an intertextual and interspatial Persianate world. But that begs the question, a navigation tool towards what? Navigation towards what or where? Well, I say towards, or rather through, a pre-national Persianate geography, and how that geography and people's relationships to its various regions was understood at the time and in the various emic terms of the time in question, as we've heard, being the 18th and earlier 19th century. This brings me to my mention of the evidence, the primary evidence, as being evanescent in nature, to the subtly semantic nature of Manichae's data set in asking how selves related to places across the regions connected through the common use of Persian. The great strength of the book here is in its focus on emic conceptions of place, and in part 2 of origin, or somewhere in fact between the emic and the etic, because that traditional social scientific binary between the emic and the internal, and the etic, the external, doesn't quite fit. Because in a sense, at least for those Persian users and Persian speakers for whom Persian wasn't their native language, of course, which creates the Persianate world, Persian isn't an emic language. So the binary of emic and etic doesn't actually quite work here. It makes me think in a way that recently some historians have argued for not only primary and secondary sources, but perhaps for primary, secondary, and tertiary documents. And perhaps we need something there which is somewhere between the emic and the etic, because that's what Persian is doing for at least some of its users for whom the language wasn't a first language, it was a learned second language. And so its terms and key concepts that Mana looked at were, of course, not fully emic terms. They weren't fully internal terms. They were secondary, or rather perhaps in tertiary terms in that respect. Still, I'd like to focus on place, and particularly terms of place and conceptions of place, which is to say the first part of the book. And the first 3 chapters of part 1, as we've already heard in Mana's presentation, explore what she calls modes of placemaking. And Mana makes 3 inroads for looking at these modes. The first is lexicography, concepts of space, or rather concepts that turn space into place. And here she uses the term affective concepts, because it's the fact that these terms are, perhaps as she's already mentioned, not the sort of objective terms of empirical or physical geography, but affective, emotionally laden terms, giving us a sense, of course, of the highly literary nature of so much of the source material in a Persian and Persianate Adab altogether. So these are affective concepts, terms, keywords that turn, as it were, neutral space into meaningful and emotively meaningful place. The second inroad, and the second chapter, looks at historical narrative and the ways in which meanings of place were made through recourse to the past, through recourse to narrative traditions, historical or otherwise, about the past of particular urban spaces in particular, whether royal histories or indeed literary histories, which brings together then some of the different genres of tarikh and tazkara, of literary compendium and historical chronicle, which are brought together in the book. And the third inroad that she uses in the third chapter looks at the moral dimensions of place. And I think this is particularly important. I think something that's often been left out in studies of Persian text, or indeed kind of historical studies of the way we actually use Persian text, because the moral aspects of these source materials are, of course, a crucial part of Adab, which is both literary and ethical in quality. For this reason, then, Mana talks about a morally justified hierarchy between places, as they were described and indeed conceived and categorized. Because Mana is not, so to speak, a proponent of a flat earth theory. Rather, she shows a Persianate geography where some places were more valued than others. And of course, that's natural to any cultural geography, whether Persianate or otherwise. But what's more important is that her book provides the semantic key to understanding why some of those places were more esteemed than others. And indeed, Persianate Selves gives us a whole set of such keys, such interpretive keys. And these interpretive, or indeed semantic and conceptual keys, these what are described as emic, or somewhere between emic and etic, these semantic keys are then words, narratives, and moral values, which have been revealed in Persianate Selves through close readings and comparative readings, a method that Mana calls critical philological engagement. I'd like to focus for a moment more on this issue of method, because we have no Mughal or Safavid archive as such, and so our most abundant evidence for the period is textual and indeed literary in nature. So how should we use such text as historians? What questions can we answer with such literary evidence? How should we historicize these sources, and in phenomenological terms, dehistoricize or de-presentize ourselves in order to understand those sources in illo tempore, couldn't resist a bit more Latin, in their own time, as historians, of course, are meant to do. And methodology and new ways of thinking about methodology adapted to different sources and different questions and different problems, of course, of what drive our discipline forward. This returns me to the usefulness of Persianate Selves then, as a vademecum, as a guide to what we might call adab in motion, literary culture in motion, to a composite ethical disposition and literary tradition, which made the relations between people and places consistent in meaning and thereby coherent across the spatial and temporal distance that comprised the Persianate world's horizons, or its afaq, to use another emic, or at least Persian term that cropped up so often in these literary texts. But consistent and coherent is not to say uniform. And this is another of the great strengths of the book, that Mana shows disagreements and indeed different evaluations of places. Rather, shared adab, the shared Persian literary culture, enabled the mutual intelligibility that comprised the Persianate world as a region held together by shared texts. Mutually intelligible, but not necessarily implying then that everyone had made, every participant had made up the same opinions about different places or indeed other questions altogether. As Manichaea puts it then, quote, experience, she means the experience of place, I think, experience was thus mediated through received forms of language and its accumulated traditions, end of quote. So shared concept words, shared language, and their shared literary documents, of course, which are composites and indeed arguments and participations and indeed disagreements within this shared literary sphere. And those received forms of language included as their most basic components certain keywords for conceiving space and hence for making place. Terms such as vatan, which she translates as homeland, and mamlikat, domain, though there are many others she discusses. Terms that thereby provided the basic semantic building blocks for what she calls geocultural landscapes. The geography that emerges is not one of nationalism then. She scrupulously uses Hindustan instead of India and reminds us that Iran was often known as Iraq-e-Ajam. Instead, we see a Persianate world in which Persian Adab was the tool for making proximity, for making relations between different persons and different places, and did so in less predetermined ways than those of later Indian and Iranian nationalisms. As I conclude my comments, I'd like to congratulate Mana on her book and to end, as I've been asked to do, with a question. On page 29, there's a very suggestive sentence that stayed with me for some time after my reading, bringing me back to it. And that sentence runs, place registered in many ways, but not everywhere, end of quote. So my question is, what spaces or types of space were not registered or included in this Persianate geocultural landscape? Put differently, what spaces could Persianate Adab not turn into coherently meaningful places? Thank you for bearing with me.
Thank you, Niall. And I guess it's over to me now. I just need to warn you that I'm having a little bit of trouble with Zoom. So if I freeze or sound funny, and hopefully, I will have at least said something of use. But firstly, I just want to say thank you so much for the invitation to celebrate
Hi, everyone.
to the individual Persianate self in its relations with collective networks of selves, encapsulated holistically in Adab and in literary an autobiographical representation that are together concerned with commemoration of people and their lives. They involve an overlap between writing one's life, composing a history of one's times, including biographical accounts of eminent men, and locating one's authorial self within social, political, familial, and literary circles. And crucially, you point out that Iran and Hindustan throughout the middle decades of the 18th century. And it's precisely then, and for those reasons, I've argued that the first tazkiras of Hindustani musicians, written in Persian by Persianate Selves, were produced. The first
Katherine?
in the center of music. Yeah, sorry.
Can I stop
Can you hear me?
Just because we're having,
Yeah.
I think we're all having quite a lot of trouble with the sound on your end.
Okay. Can you
do you
hear
think
at all?
It's cutting in and out, and I wonder if it might be helpful for you to log off and log back in.
Sure. I'll come back in.
Okay, and then I don't know if this is helpful at all. Should we have Afshin go,
Yeah.
and then you come in, because I think a lot of your comments unfortunately were lost they got garbled.
Why don't we try to do that?
I'll come back in.
Do that, and then we can reverse the order, and maybe we can pick up where she left off. So let me try to add a few things here, and I guess this kind of just confirms why we actually need to have real conferences and workshops where we're all in the same room. So let's not get carried away with Zoom. But let me try to add a little bit here. Thank you all for being here, and thank you for Mana for the invitation. It's nice to see you all, and especially our people in our virtual studio audience, as it were. Let me try to make a few disconnected points, picking up on some of the themes that have already been mentioned. There's obviously so much to say about this book, and I'm just skimming across the surface here, but maybe I can try to say something from the point of view of modern Iranian, the history of modern Iranian nationalism in particular, which is really my particular area. I do want to kind of echo some of the things that have already been said and just sort of emphasize how important this book is. This book really is a great achievement, Mana. And I think it certainly stands alongside Hodgson. We've been having a lot of discussions of Hodgson, and we've been revisiting Hodgson's ideas of the Persianate the last number of years. It's been very useful. And to build on what he started, you might say, I think we would all agree that he actually left a lot of things unexamined. And I think one of the achievements of this book is that you really have picked up, in a sense, where he's left off. And this Persianate cultural system, I think you've provided us with a much fuller, really a much more vivid kind of accounting of this place than maybe even what we found in Hodgson. So I think that's really one of the main achievements of the book. And I think I'll just say, I think it would be a shame if this book is relegated to, early modern Iranian history, because obviously the implications of this go far beyond the early modern period and far beyond Iranian studies or Middle East studies as well. So let me try to say a little bit more about this methodological question, which I think Nile already brought up, and I won't say too much more because both of you already mentioned it. But you do have a discussion of methodological nationalism. I think that's the term you use, or proto-nationalism, the problem of proto-nationalism, sort of essentially historians who have uncritically or maybe casually projected modern concepts of nationalism into their readings of the early modern period, a kind of anachronism, you might say. Finding things that weren't in the sources, or maybe emphasizing minor points because they, echo later nationalist ideas. And I think what you've done is you've sort of shown how to be rigorous and careful to avoid that. And in order to do that, that's what you've done is you've read the sources on their own. And I think maybe Nile mentioned this in some ways as well. These commemorative texts, you allow them to kind of speak for themselves in a sense. If there's one sort of way of thinking about your method, I don't know if you would put it this way, but I thought of it as a kind of a hyper-contextualization. And that's kind of maybe how I sort of saw what you were trying to do with your interpretive method, as it were. And I think it yields a great deal of benefits. And just from the point of view of modern Iranian history, maybe I can pick up on a few examples that I got out of this, sort of echoing some of the themes that have already been emphasized. This idea of place, for example. In the Persianate system, you argue that the idea of place was understood in this, I think the term you use is a deterritorialized notion of geography, which might sound like a contradiction, but of course it's only a contradiction if you're looking through the lens of modern nationalism. And in the Persianate system, according to Mana, we don't find this kind of obsessive territorialization, or another term that you use, a kind of modernist idea of geographic essentialism, which is what characterizes modern nationhood. A place like Iran, for example, it's obviously a term that has existed and people knew about it, but as you show, it wasn't even the most important marker. It was one marker from among many others. And, you know, Khorasan, Ajam, Turan, Hindustan, Rum, others, all of these weren't mutually exclusive. And very often they overlapped or were interconnected, or different sources will use them in different meanings. There's a kind of fluidity in their usage, even within the sources. So it's only in the modern period that a place like Iran sort of, acquires its territorial definition that we're sort of familiar with. Another theme that sort of highlights this way of reading the sources is your discussion of race and ethnicity, which is, of course, like land, another one of these obsessions of modern nationalism. And in the chapter that you discuss, kinship without ethnicity, which you talked about as well, this sounds like another seeming contradiction, which of course it's not, because in the Persianate system, as you explain, kinship without ethnicity was not a contradiction. And of course, in modern Iranian nationalism, it's this Aryan idea that has been central to defining a kind of ethno-national basis of Iranian identity, at least for a century and a half or so. By contrast, what we find in the Persianate cultural system, as you've sort of explained for us, is a very different notion of ethnicity that's not based on biological or racial or ethnic association, but it's a different kind of kinship that's that you define but with another very interesting phrase that you've coined, this idea of lineages of affiliation, which is, a very kind of Hodgsonian kind of way of, doing in a great Hodgsonian tradition and inventing a new kind of way of explaining a concept here. Lineages of affiliation, which is a descent not only based on patrimonial descent, but also through service to patrons, as you discuss, a line of teachers, association with a tradition of poetry, a poetic lineage. All of these are non-biological forms of kinship that were part of this pre-national Persianate world. Let me maybe add one more idea here, and that's, of course, history, which is like land and race, another obsession of the modern nation. And in the context of Iranian nationalism, of course, it's the pre-Islamic past that is the part of the past that is often defined as embodying a kind of true Iranian past, the true undiluted, authentic Iranian past. And Mana has a great deal to say about this. And in contrast to modern nationalist readings, she argues that in the Persianate tradition, there is no sharp divide between the pre-Islamic and the Islamic. There's certainly an awareness of the pre-Islamic past, but it was one layer among others that were in fact kind of interwoven with each other as part of these traditions of Persianate universal histories. And your discussion of the Shahnameh is probably a very good example of this. Modern nationalist historians obviously isolate the Shahnameh as a kind of proto-nationalist text, But what you've done, or what these nationalists do, is they ignore that the Shahnameh was actually one text among many others, and that by the 18th century, the past that was elaborated in the Shahnameh had been interwoven into a Persianate universal history, like the Rosetta Safa that you mentioned, which draws on Tabari, the Shahnameh, and many other sources. And there was a kind of Persianate understanding of history that was inclusive of many pasts, which of course in the national period we lose, if you will. Let me just add maybe one more idea here, if we I think have a little bit of time. And ultimately, I think this sort of goes to the importance of this book, is that it gives us a lot of new tools and concepts to use, to think with, as we try to think about not only the early modern period, but the modern period as well. And you've developed a whole series of these concepts that we can use, this notion of a cultural continuum, or cultural gradations, or cultural interpermeability. These are the phrases that I kind of tried to pick up out of the book. Instead of national identity, Mana asks us to consider the notion of Persianate identifications, which is a form of identification that is accrued, as she tells us, through travel, mobility, life experience, affiliation with teachers, patrons, Sufi orders, a lineage of poets and whatnot. It's a cultural system that is very different than the modern national one. And ultimately, I think this is maybe the book's contribution, certainly from my perspective, is that it helps a historian of modern Iranian nationalism in the Middle East, South Asia, more generally understand just how disruptive nationalism was when it began to impose itself onto this Persianate world beginning in the 19th century. And so I think ultimately for me, that's kind of the most important maybe way to think about how I would approach this book. And if you want to pose a question, maybe I'll just ask about this question of social depth. What can we say beyond, is this world of the Persianate restricted to one particular social strata, an aristocracy of poets or republic of letters? Or how far down does it go? Do the sources tell us anything about that, or can we infer that beyond that? I mean, I'll just say briefly that, despite all the failures of the nation, the uniformity that the nation imposed was done in the interest, at least in the kind of most progressive forms of it, as part of an ideal of equal citizenship. And I'm wondering if there's anything, that kind of ideal of social depth in the Persianate. Maybe we can have something to think about that. So I will leave it there. Maybe we can try to go back to Katherine.
Shall we have another go? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. Okay, I'm sorry about that. So I don't know how much you managed to hear of that. A lot of which was mostly congratulatory on a wonderful book. And I wanted to kind of just dive actually into some of the detail and talk about some of these commemorative texts, and particularly the Persianate commemorative text par excellence, which is the Tazkira, which historians have often misdescribed as a set of biographical dictionaries, or a set of biographies of a particular class of people, often used as a kind of a mine of empirical facts, which of course is not how they should be used. And your work just shows us how much more Tazkiras are than that. And I've just got a little quotation here from the middle of the last chapter about the commemoration of the Tazkira is an act of memory undertaken together. So it's not just about individual selves, it's about the collective network of selves. Commemorative texts recollect various assortments of figures, inviting readers to join their authors in acts of remembering. Narration also brings the author into being as a figure with and through the assembly he remembers, both for himself and for his audience. It is worth remembering that it's really always a he writing the Tazkira. In these textual acts of remembering, we modern readers can see the range of Persianate collectives that could be imagined and the Persianate selves that could be produced. And I think this is a really crucial point. But also what was particularly important to me as a historian of Hindustani music in 18th century India, you point out tazkiras acted to cultivate moral integrity, to guard against memory's loss, and also that this is why they tended to flourish when political and social systems were unstable and under threat, as was the case in both Iran and Hindustan throughout the middle decades of the 18th century. And it's precisely then, and for those reasons, I've argued, that the first tazkiras of Hindustani musicians written in Persian by Persianate Hindustanis were produced. And the first one, 1753, and then there's a rash of them through to the 1840s. So the center of musical excellence in 17th and 18th century India was the Mughal imperial capital of Delhi. And elite performers of the Hindustani system of art music were all hereditary professionals of relatively low status but high cultural value. And they were even more vulnerable then to political upheaval than poets, because music was their profession and because music was not written down. If the musicians died, the music died. And as Nadir Shah and then Ahmad Shah Abdali invaded and sacked Delhi, and musicians and patrons scattered to the four winds, musical selves began to write down the biographies and lineages of musicians, not to preserve the music itself, which was embodied, but as a record and memory of who truly represented Mughal Delhi's traditions and was most worthy of patronage, acted as a passport. And also of remembering wherever they went to find fortune and fame, Benares, Lucknow, Patna, Jaipur, Hyderabad, Calcutta. But one thing I wanted to think about a little bit too was that Hindustani musical selves throw up some conundrums for the ideas of Persianate place, origin, and selfhood that you articulate so beautifully. And I really love your use of the idea of the aporia to talk about the coexistence of irreconcilable ideas of place, origin, and self that actually don't need to be reconciled. That's a modern compulsion. And it reminded me of Molly Aitken, the art historian, her use of parataxis to describe Mughal and Rajput painters' juxtaposition of different frames in one plane, often borrowed from different cultural traditions, which leave the viewer to imagine their potential relationships. And, you know, an interesting figure here is Rahim Khanikanan, who you identify as a Persian, but who was also renowned in the early 17th century as a great poet and connoisseur of Braj classical Hindi, courtly poetry. And his daughter wrote a treatise on Hindustani music in Braj based on Sanskrit theory for the Mughal Emperor Shah Jahan. So there's something interesting there going on with the Persianate and the Indic, which I want to kind of think about here. Because when we throw the Indian subcontinent into the mix, there is quite a big aporia that we need to consider, which is the relationships of Persianate to Sanskritic knowledge systems and worlds. A term you appear not to like using is Indic. Here I prefer it because by the 17th century, Sanskrit was being replaced by Braj Bhasha or classical Hindi as the vehicle for what had been embodied in Sanskrit knowledge, so Indic. And of course, Richard Eaton's new book on India and the Persianate age makes the important point that the Persianate and Sanskritic cosmopolises accommodated to each other for at least 800 years in the subcontinent, beginning from the time of the Shahnameh. And that by the time the Mughals entered the frame in 1526, the Persianate and Sanskritic completely overlapped in Hindustan and the Deccan. And this was important for the development of Hindustani classical music, the use of rags and tals and a various set of genres for elite patrons. The Hindustani tradition we know today coalesced at the Mughal court as an accommodation of Indic and Persianate structures, forms, ensembles, and song genres. But even when the Hindustani musical system was elaborated in 17th century Persian treatises, it was conceptualized as native to India and essentially Sanskritic, and particularly the melodic modes or ragas and the rhythmic cycles or talas. And both Sanskrit and Persian music treatises of the 16th and 17th century recognized both the music of Ajam and Naghmai Hindustan, the music of Hindustan, as cognate but separate. So where Hindustan had rags and tals, the music of Aj used maqam and usul. systems were enjoyed in India until the 18th century, and there was some mixing, such as turning some maqams like Hijaz into rags like Hijazi. But they were recognized in Persian texts written by Persianate patrons and musicians as separate, different, native to different geographical domains, and Hindustani music, particularly as Indic at root. And further on Conundra, there's a couple of very nice ones concerning two of the men that you write about in Persianate Selves. I'm thinking particularly of the Tazkira writer Hazin and the migrant poet Qizilbash Khan Umid. And I think it's rather lovely that although Hazin's Tazkira expresses his deep nostalgia and longing for his Iranian homeland and his alienation from, indeed, his disdain for Hindustan, his Persian ghazals continued to be popularly sung by courtesans as art songs in Hindustani ragas, not Persian maqams, in late 18th century Lucknow. And they were remembered in Urdu novels as late as the 1890s. So his poetry became Hindustani. You also note that Umid was remarkable for his connoisseurship of Hindustani music, even though he was recently arrived from Iran. What was interesting to me was the hints you supply that his social background may not have been very high. And this would make sense of his very intimate friendship with the greatest hereditary Hindustani musician of the 18th century, Niamat Khan Sadarang, who, quite apart from his own liminal social status, had been embroiled in considerable political scandal in the 1710s. Which leads me back to my question in a kind of a roundabout way of how the Persianate and Sanskritic accommodated to each other in Persianate Hindustan. And it may be unanswerable, but from an Indian perspective, the Sanskritic part of the equation, or the Indic part, is equally crucial. And I loved your chapter on kinship and lineage and naming, all three in the second part. And you show us all the things that we've been getting wrong about lineage and kinship by insisting on the primacy of blood. And I especially liked your in-depth discussion of exactly what biological kinship entailed. And you show that they're not restricted simplistically by blood or milk, but there's a range of connections that people found significant. And you do note that adoption in Hindustan was recognized as by Persianates as an acceptable mode of kinship, even though it was not specifically Islamic practice. I'm wondering whether, given this expansionary picture you offer us, how Hindustani Persians dealt with or accommodated with caste, and India as a caste society. Conversely, this may be impossible to answer, how writers in Sanskrit and other Indian languages dealt with, accommodated with Persianate kinship structures. How did they see Persians? The strictly endogamous kinship structures that we misname caste were rife in India throughout the Persianate age. And this idea of social group endogamy is now backed up as at least a 1500-year practice in India by significant DNA evidence. And this practice of endogamy in social groups included many Indians, including Muslims, who would qualify as Persianate. And these include Hindustani musicians. So Hindustani musicians like Niamat Khan Sadarang were practitioners of an art form that was agreed to be essentially Indic. They became the chief Hindustani musicians to the Mughal emperors. They sang classical Hindi songs, they were versed in Sanskrit music theory, but they were Muslim, Persian educated and literate, and hereditary and endogamous, for as long as we've got records of them. And records at the time used the terms Jat, Zat, and Qom for musician communities. And even the most elite were regarded as separate from the Zat-i Sharif, at least as early as the mid-17th century. And they retained and passed on their musical secrets within the biological family, preferably patrilineal sons and brothers' sons. But if under threat, they passed it on to matrilineal or marital males, and they formally adopted them as sons. And they did take unrelated disciples, especially courtesans whose male offspring didn't count. But these didn't, as far as I can work out, usually then father or mother lineages of their own until the 20th century. So I guess you know, my question is, what happens when the Persianate meets the Sanskritic? What happens when Persianate kinship structures meet caste? How do these things get accommodated, or is this simply an aporia that we have to live with? But thank you for a most wonderful book. And thank you to my technology for lasting.
Yeah, you came back very clearly. Thank you all for these wonderful questions and thoughts. And I wanted to, I see that we're sort of coming to the end of the hour, and the suggestion has been for me to kind of give a very quick response and then to post some of the questions from the audience. I'm very sorry to not be able to engage with other questions and thoughts, but maybe some of these will, maybe some of my answers will be helpful in thinking about it. I do think I'm going to kind of speak about them in a wide-ranging way. I do think the question that Nile brought up is very helpful in the sense that I tried very hard not to claim that everything Persianate was good, and that, you know, everyone was equally included in the same way. And what I wanted to account for, however, were hierarchies. And I think that going back to Afshin's point, there is a kind of ideal in the national and modern formulation of ideal of equal citizenship, as you put it, right? Which is a kind of rights-based regime, which isn't the same at all as social hierarchies, moral valuation, and these sorts of things, right? So we can take and bracket legal rights in a particular way, and then we can think about what sorts of hierarchies and inequalities that discourse, in fact, actually papers over and does not address. And one of the things that I wanted to kind of do is outside of a kind of one is idealized, one sort of is vaunted in its idealized way, to kind of think of the mess that we're in now, where we have all of these glaring inequalities that we live with in the context of a purported equal rights regime in many places, and yet that doesn't address certain kinds of inequalities. And so the question, I think, for imagining a way out of it is to look beyond the strictures that gave us the problem. And that's why I think looking at pre-modern and early modern ideas, not to go back to them or recreate them, but to think about what ways they may be inspirational. Because I do think that even though there's hierarchy and there's devaluation, and there's certain things get made liminal, right? Not every traveler going through every place lauds every village that they move through or every land, and some places, like a number of pastoral, rural, illiterate places do not get understood, or it can even be unspeakable, right? When we think about people passing through space, a lot of times it's just about the amount of time it took to get to the next real place, right? But what I do think is that what I saw was an ability to accommodate and make it okay that there was a range and a plurality and a multiplicity. Some was great, some was not so great, some had some good things, and the fact that they all kind of can sit in an assemblage and not be cast completely out because of a certain kind of apparatic sensibility. And that's where the idea came in about thinking about, how to bring in the notion of gradation in. Now, the final question about the Indic, I mean, that's a great question, and it's definitely not one I can answer, but I hope with this book was also to kind of inspire new conversations. You know, I think most of us mere mortals don't have all of the language and time and facility to be able to address all of these questions, which is probably why Nile's book was an edited volume, right? It's a collaborative effort. And so these are wonderful questions. I would say that my main point, though, is that a lot of the scholarship on South Asia really wants to make what happens there with Persian special to South Asia. And I think that paying attention to the Persian tradition and seeing how it incorporated different traditions and thought systems and histories before is also very helpful. And one thing that was very instructive for me was looking at the way in which this gets done earlier in the Ilkhanid context. When the Mongol traditions are brought in and certain kinds of equivalences are made, you know, Oghuz Khan becomes likened to Jamshid. And in general, the pre-Islamic kind of Persian narrative of history becomes a way to include non-Muslims into the Persianate tradition. And this is a specific contextual appropriateness of this history and its use. Specific to an early modern context with the logic of Adab. And I thought that was very interesting. And it's a different kind of use of the pre-Islamic than happens in the modern period, right? To exclude, right? So, I mean, those are just some thoughts in response to your excellent questions. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much to all the attendees here today. This has been a fantastic event, and I really want to thank Afshin, Nile, and Katherine, and most especially Mana. And as Mana mentioned, we'll pull together a blog piece with the questions that were asked here, and we'll include that along with the link to the event itself. But on behalf of Stanford University Press, thank you so much for attending our event today, and have a good rest of the week and enjoyable weekend. Thanks, everyone.